Many of us are grappling with the issues of racism and the pandemic. But do these issues impact all of us the same? What about our agricultural workers? And what can history tell us? Welcome to Exploring Santa Cruz, a bi-weekly program with hosts Jean Kratzer and Mathilde Rand. I'm Mathilde Rand, and on the phone is Sandy Lydon, retired history faculty member of Cabrillo College and classroom teacher for 59 years. Today we will focus on agricultural workers in our region. Sandy Lydon's background in agriculture includes an ag major at UC Davis, being a proud member of the Hollister Hay Baler Hall of Fame, and being one of the two founders of the California Agricultural Workers History Research Center, located in the Watsonville Library. The other founder is Jeffrey Dunn. During the fall and spring semesters of 1987-1988, Sandy taught a class on the history of agriculture in the Pajaro Valley, which culminated in a comprehensive outline researched by his students. Welcome, Sandy, to the program.
That's great. Was it that long ago? 1988, 89?
I'm afraid so, yeah.
We were children then.
I think we were.
Because you were in that class.
I was in that class, and I fully, I think that's the reason why years later I wanted to do a program with you. So tell me, are the issues the same in our area as they were in Minnesota when George Floyd was killed? And are they the same now as in the past?
Well, obviously things are never the same, but they're similar, and they have echoes that are similar. I've been very interested in watching the Black Lives Matter wave come west out of Minnesota, out of George Floyd's tragic murder, and watching the various manifestations of it as it has come out and spread actually all over, I think, the world in many ways, and particularly interested in the all of a sudden wonderful interest in history. It's not very often that history matters, and it seems to be mattering now because people are looking back to look at the antecedents, the racist stuff that's in their own background. And I think that's been a very healthy, good thing. I think that the statue factories probably are not cranking out as many statues anymore for the moment, because I think we're examining all of our heroes and heroines, and I think what we'll find as we examine all humans is that they're all flawed. We're all flawed. So I'm very, very interested in finding and helping people understand that we too have in this area have similar situations to George Floyd, not necessarily via law enforcement, but people who were killed during various anti-immigrant flurries, whose crimes have never been solved and are rarely even known. I think everybody's got the original sin of racism in their history, and it's we need to help people bring it to light. The libraries are closed, people can't go to the library, and
right.
And other than non-commercial radio, which is a wonderful source for things, but you can't do research. Well, you can, I guess, you can go back through your archives, but people are forced to go out on the internet, and the internet is not always trustworthy. So that's the job of real historians. A lot of fake history out there, and so my job is I have a segment on my website called Hui History, where we try to take care of. If I went after every mistake, that's all I'd be doing. So I don't do it very often, but there we are. So
Well,
yeah, we've got original sin. Well, yeah, we do.
we do. So let's focus on some of those. So what particular historical information should we talk about today, to help us get a wider understanding of the issues that led, for instance, to the killing of agricultural workers of color in our area? Could you give some examples?
Yeah. Well, I think first, and historians drive people nuts because we always talk about context.
Sure.
And whenever I say, well, first of all, you need to have some context, and it's like spinach. People look at me and go, oh, I don't want. Their eyes roll back, and they oh no, here comes some more context. But we kind of do need, I think, in the history of ag here, and particularly the history of ag labor, so that people have to have an understanding of what the sequence was, and so the list is short for the main ag labor sequences, and it starts with the California Indians, who actually were agriculturalists in some ways even before the coming of Europeans. They were land managers, and then you move to the mission period, where they were very much the laborers, and then there's the Mexican period when they were the laborers still. So the California Indians are first, then their numbers begin to decline, and they're replaced by the Chinese, who first enter the region in 1866, and Chinese dominate ag labor up until the turn of the century. That's an easy way to remember it. And then the anti-Chinese movement was so strong in the country. It was strong in California, and then California convinced the legislators from the rest of the places in the country where there were no Chinese to pass the exclusion law in 1882, which is really a landmark of American immigration legislation, because it prohibited people of Chinese ancestry, except for merchants and scholars, and the scholars weren't lined up from in China to come to America, but by race rather than by country of origin. So if you were Chinese and wanted to come in, say, from Canada, you were prohibited from coming in no matter where you wanted to come in from. And so that starts in 82, and that has an enormous effect on Chinese immigration, and the numbers go down. Most of the Chinese immigrants were male, and there's very few places where there was a balance of males and female Chinese immigrants. And since there were no children, then their population starts to go down, and California agriculture is looking for a solution to that diminishment, and they will settle on the Japanese. The Japanese start coming in the late 90s, 1890s, and until they are excluded in 1924. So you've got a 2.5-decade span. But the Japanese will continue because they come in a balanced immigration so that they will have children, so that as the exclusion starts to work on the immigrants, the families are still here to maintain their presence. So they don't disappear in many ways like the Chinese did initially. So it would be California Indians, Chinese, Japanese, Filipinos, and because the Philippines became a United States possession at the turn of the century, and they will begin to provide Filipino men during the decades up to up to World War II, when the Japanese were removed completely from the story.
Right.
And then we have a smattering of Mexican immigrants in the 30s, but there's a deportation movement then, so they don't really become the dominant ag laborers until starting in 1942 with the braceros, who were brought here to replace the Japanese and the Filipinos. Filipinos went into the army, and the Japanese went to camp.
Right.
And so that's pretty much the sequence, because then Mexican farm labor, braceros, then they bring their families. Then we have Central Americans added to that group. And then all mixed in. There's you've got the Dust Bowl immigrants that are coming in the 30s. There's little bursts of other immigrant groups. You got Sikhs coming in at the turn of the century in 1900. There's a number of Sikh ag labor crews. Farmers were the big landowners and agriculturalists were always looking for a labor force that they could completely control and who didn't want to live here and have their kids go to your school. I guess that's just a blunt way of putting it. Because if they had their families, then the agriculturalists would feel responsible for for their children. Mm-hmm. Those who were compassionate, and so that's why up at Davis, the ag technology departments, the ones that are building machinery, are always the hope is that if you can grow something that can be planted, managed, and harvested by a machine, that's nirvana, right? That's the holy grail. And they're working on it. They're still working on it. And so you see a lot more mechanization, but there is no way that human hands in the ag business can be replaced. They just can't.
So let us go back to the era when there was such a hatred, basically, of the Chinese. Can we go back to the 1880s and what happened in Santa Cruz?
Well,
County?
we've got the anti-Chinese movement in California was widespread, universal. But Santa Cruz County happened to be the epicenter of the anti-Chinese movement in the state, and actually the city of Santa Cruz, the epicenter. Right. Because the city of Santa Cruz was still a manufacturing economy, and none of the manufacturing that they did needed Chinese labor. Chinese were in the service economy. They were domestics, cooks, but they weren't allowed to work in the woods, except, for example, to be the camp cook. Mm-hmm. They could cut firewood, but when you got into lumber and then the big stuff, they weren't allowed to work there. So they weren't necessary in Santa Cruz. But Watsonville was an ag community, the Pajaro Valley, and Watsonville needed the Chinese. So you've got a wonderful sort of bickering, the historic bickering between Santa Cruz and Watsonville that focused on the Chinese. Mm-hmm. The Chinese worked in all phases of ag, and in 1888 there were vineyards, not many, but a few, up Vine Hill Road, which is why it's named after vines. Mm-hmm. I believe the landowner in this case was Mr. Jarvis, the Jarvis Road. All the roads reflect a little history. And there was a young man, I think he was 17, and why this happened, it's really hard to know, but he was killed, and it would appear, based on what the coroner said later, that he was strangled, hanged, probably, whipped, and then when his body came to light, and law enforcement and the coroner had to be involved, the coroner said something like it was that he'd committed suicide. 17-year-olds committing suicide, they'd be more common now, but they weren't common then. And particularly, he would have had to flog himself, which doesn't make any sense. So it became a public case. The local Chinese community in Santa Cruz resisted the coroner's conclusion, went up to the city, got some political and legal muscle from the Chinese companies, and came down and I guess they had a second autopsy, and it was still not what the Chinese community expected to get. And one of the things that brought this whole thing to light to the public was that the Chinese community in the region went to his funeral. His name was Lu Sing.
Mm-hmm.
And his funeral was, at that time, 1888, was considered to be the largest funeral of anybody that had ever happened. And the Evergreen Cemetery on the outskirts of Santa Cruz at the time, out by Harvey West Park, there's a Chinese section in that cemetery, one which I would suggest to your listeners, when you get some spare time and you're looking for something to do, to go out there to the Evergreen Cemetery, because there's been some really wonderful commemoration done for the Chinese out there. Mm-hmm. And there's some historical markers. There's an arch. I mean, it's really lovely. But Lu Sing was buried out there, and we don't know for sure whether he's still there, his remains, because deceased Chinese were exhumed by Chinese companies, the 6 companies that I just mentioned up in San Francisco. Mm-hmm. And then they were shipped, their remains, their bones were shipped back to China, because the Chinese believed that your spirits needed to be tended by your families. And since this was all guys, they didn't have families here. There was actually a small cottage industry within the Chinese community of getting bones returned to China. And so it's very possible that Lu Sing may have been shipped home. Right. Those of you that know about feng shui, evil spirits are the spirits of deceased Chinese in the traditional belief that have not been taken care of by their families. They're wandering. They're troublemakers, and not in the sense of John Lewis, good troublemakers. The hungry ghosts can be a real problem, mm-hmm. And so it's the community that would like to see the remains go back into the arms of their family. It cuts down the number of your brakes failing on Highway 17 or something. So what we have done, and I've been involved in this a little bit, along with George Au Jr. and a number of members in the community in Santa Cruz, we believe that there are remains still there in the cemetery, because the graves were not marked with stone monuments, but with wooden, and the wooden ones have deteriorated, and mm-hmm. so we don't know who's in there, right, in that cemetery. And we believe that there are some, and plus there are Chinese burials all over the mountains, all over the region. When guys went down, and wasn't the resources to take care of them, so they might have been buried where they fell. So that means, in the traditional view, that there's hungry ghosts all over the place.
I hear.
So we feel that we have become their families. That is, taking on the responsibility of honoring them, observing some of the traditional days in the Chinese calendar, so that not just for self-interest, not just because we don't want our breaks to fail, but I think also because it's the right thing to do. They were trapped here.
Right. That is an incredible story, Sandy. Thank you so much for sharing it with us. And there's more about this and other stories in your book called Chinese Gold. Before we go on, I would like to remind our listeners that you're tuned to Exploring Santa Cruz at KSQD 90.7 FM. We're here with Sandy Lydon, retired history faculty member of Cabrillo College and a classroom teacher for 59 years. The topic is racism and the impact on agricultural workers in our region. I would like to ask you, because there was another more public case in the 1930s with Fermin Tobera, a Filipino farm worker. Could you tell us a little bit about that? Because that really involved a whole community in the murder of this young man.
Yeah, you're right. I think Fermin Tobera has gotten a lot more notice because at the time when he was killed in 1930, there were more newspapers. It was, it was a much more sensational thing. But basically, there was an anti-Filipino riot in Watsonville in January of 1930, and it had risen up because of a dance hall that had been opened up out on Beach Road, where the Filipinos hired Caucasian dancers to come into the hall, and then they would pay to dance with them. It wasn't that they were dancing like exotic dancers up on a stage, but they were dancing with the women. And younger white guys in Watsonville apparently couldn't handle that. And so a riot actually went on for 4 days. It was the largest anti-Filipino riot in the history of California. Toward the end of it,
and there were about like 500 white men. I mean, it was just not a couple. It was like 500 white men that went out.
Oh yeah, there was a lot. And there was high school kids and 20-somethings. We're on the front edge of the Depression. The Depression really hasn't bitten them yet, but you've got that sort of concern that the Filipinos, who were dapper dudes, and they dressed stylishly. They put a lot of their hard-earned ag workers' money into their clothes. They were styling, and it challenged white males. They didn't like it. It's one thing, you can work in the fields or you can play pool downtown or whatever, but you start messing with our women. And even though these were, how should we say, professional women who had come up from Southern California, they weren't local high school girls that were doing this. This was a commercial thing. Taxi dance halls were a fixture in wherever there were large groups of Filipinos. They had learned about recreation American style because they were an American colony, and they'd seen Hollywood movies and before they even came here. So it was a spark that set off the things in Watsonville, and there was a couple of bunkhouses out on Murphy Road, out on the east side of Watsonville, that a group of guys, young guys, apparently with guns, went out and shot up the building. And in his bunk killed in the dead of night was Fermin Tobera, and he was 24, and he became a symbol, a symbol in the Philippines for things that were going wrong with Filipino-American relations. His body was shipped back to Manila, and he lay in state in Manila at the Jose Rizal Monument, which was, the epicenter of Philippine history and Filipino nationalism. And 100,000 people, apparently, in the Philippines, in Manila, viewed his casket. He was huge in Manila. I was in Manila and got into their archives to see. Unfortunately, World War II burned up an awful lot of records in the Philippines, but I was able to find some of the accounts at that end of the story in the Philippines, and there were a half a dozen guys who were kind of tried, kind of not, slapped on the wrist, that kind of stuff, who were thought to be responsible. Jeff Tagami, who was a former student of mine from years ago who's recently passed away, he's a poet. He did a wonderful poem. The title, I believe, is Fermin, and or it may be Tobera. It's either one or the other. It's in a small paperback that you can still hunt down, called October Light,
yeah.
Light, by Jeff Tagami. And his murderers were never brought to justice. Racism was at the heart of this whole thing. And he and Lu Sing, and I'm sure there's so many others that have not really ever come to light. And I think it's our job to
bring it to light.
I think we need to hunt them down and hunt these stories down and see what we can do. It's like the thing we did at the Chinese cemetery. You do what you can to undo. You can't go back and change it, but at least recognize it. And then, who knows? Maybe we can recognize it in ourselves, in our own daily lives as we trudge through with our masks on. Oh my God!
I know.
It's
So what I want to tell you is that, to me, the project you're doing with the Chinese, and it almost looks to me like you're making things whole. You're bringing anti-racist actions towards us, helping us really think about what we do with our lives, how we think about people, and are we really being inclusive, and are we making us a whole community and not people of different ethnicities fighting each other. And unfortunately, I wish we had more time, but we don't. I want to thank you, and I hope, Sandy, that people will go to your website, sandylydon.com, and I hope we can invite you back to hear more of these incredible stories that teach us all about how to be a community.
Anytime, Mathilde, anytime.
Thank you so much.